veteran humiliated by woke crowd, until he gave a brutal reality check. The city's energy was restless and vibrant, humming with conversations and flashing lights from digital billboards towering above. In the midst of this pulsing, modern landscape, a man stood quietly, almost out of place. William Bill Edwards, a retired veteran, tugged at the collar of his worn jacket, feeling the weight of his military cap as though it bore the memories of every battle he'd ever fought. Veteran humiliated by woke crowd, until he gave a brutal reality check. The thought echoed in his mind as he joined his daughter, Emily, at her insistence, for what he thought would be a casual outing. But Bill couldn't shake a feeling of unease, as if the world he once knew had shifted entirely beneath his feet. Bill's granddaughter was performing in a local play that evening, and while he usually kept a low profile, he'd come out in support of his family. Emily had coaxed him into attending, emphasizing that he'd enjoy seeing her daughter take on her first lead role. As they walked toward the community center, a group of young, energized activists stationed outside caught sight of Bill's military cap. Their gazes sharpened, a silent communication passing between them, like wolves catching the scent of prey. Bill could sense their disapproval even before they spoke, their youth and intensity setting off warning bells in his mind. It started with a single voice, a young woman with cropped hair and piercing eyes who looked at him with a kind of smugness he hadn't encountered in years. "Hey, nice cap," she sneered, a false sweetness in her tone. Bill glanced at her, acknowledging her comment with a brief nod, hoping it would end there. But another young man chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Bet you think that cap makes you a hero or something, don't you, old man?" Emily's hand tightened around her father's arm, but she said nothing, her face torn between embarrassment and fear. Bill held his ground, his jaw clenched, his eyes softening with a calm resolve. He didn't rise to their bait, though every fiber in him wanted to defend his service, his sacrifices. He'd been raised to value respect, to avoid stirring trouble, especially with those too young to understand the world beyond their limited perspective. But he could feel the crowd's energy amplifying, their mocking laughter filling the air around him. Each taunt felt like a blow, cutting through the armor he'd spent years fortifying around himself. "You know, people like you," another voice piped up, "you're exactly why everything is so messed up in this world. Stuck in your outdated ways, supporting a system that's broken." Bill's fingers clenched, and for a brief moment, his mind flashed back to a time he'd stood shoulder to shoulder with young men and women on a foreign battlefield, people who'd put their lives in his hands. He thought of the faces he'd carried, the silent oaths he'd made, the bonds that went deeper than words. The group's words fell on him like rain on stone, but inside, his spirit flickered like a flame against a relentless wind. Emily's cheeks flushed, her eyes darting between the crowd and her father. She could see the tension building in him, the way his face hardened yet remained calm, his silence more powerful than any of their taunts. She wanted to say something, to defend him, but she knew that if she spoke, she'd only make things worse. Bill had raised her to be respectful, to stand her ground, but in that moment, she felt helpless, watching her father's dignity being chipped away by words sharper than knives. Bill took a breath, steadying himself, his gaze never wavering from the group before him. In that split second, he remembered the lessons of war, the value of restraint, the power of silence, the quiet dignity in holding one's ground without giving in to anger. He'd fought battles on foreign soil, faced death, and survived. This was nothing compared to those days. And yet, the bitterness of misunderstanding stung deeper than he could have anticipated. He held back his words, but his silence only seemed to fuel their derision. The young woman with the cropped hair stepped forward, her eyes glinting with a harsh determination, as though exposing Bill's silence as weakness would affirm her own beliefs. "Why don't you say something?" she challenged, crossing her arms over her chest. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're too proud to admit that people like you are the reason we're all struggling today." Bill's expression remained composed, but a flicker of sadness crossed his face. He knew they couldn't understand. Not fully. He was up against more than a crowd. He was confronting a wall of belief, a wave of resentment that years of service, pain, and sacrifice couldn't penetrate. The crowd around them was growing, and the noise was getting louder. More onlookers joined, their eyes widening as they recognized the familiar spectacle of a confrontation. An older man facing down a throng of young, impassioned voices. And while he didn't intend to, Bill found himself on the cusp of something he hadn't felt in a long time. A challenge lay before him, and though it wasn't one he'd chosen, it was one he could no longer ignore. Just as one of the young activists moved to mock him once more, Bill's eyes hardened, a resolute look crossing his face that spoke of battles seen, lives saved, and a strength that no amount of words could diminish. Bill took a deep breath as he stood among the jeering crowd, his mind slipping back to a time and place that felt both distant and as close as his own heartbeat. The shouts around him faded, replaced by the roar of helicopters and the relentless hum of radio chatter. It was the late 1960s, and he was a young man in his early 20s just beginning his first tour of duty. He hadn't yet learned the weight of fear, nor had he understood the true depth of brotherhood and sacrifice. But he would soon enough. As he closed his eyes, he could almost smell the thick air of the jungle and feel the dampness seeping into his skin. This was the beginning of his life as a soldier. His first combat mission was etched into his mind with painful clarity. They were stationed in a dense, unforgiving stretch of jungle, tasked with patrolling an area rumored to be crawling with insurgents. Bill's heartbeat had thundered in his chest as he tried to keep his breath steady. His squad, a collection of young men barely out of high school, was just as scared, though they hid it behind forced jokes and hollow bravado. The memory of that day hit him hard. He could still see the faces of his squad members, each a reflection of his own fear, excitement, and confusion. As they pushed deeper into the jungle, Bill felt a connection to these men forming quickly, a bond forged under the most intense pressures of survival. They were all different. Some were loud and boisterous, while others, like Bill, were quiet and introspective. Yet, when the bullets began to rain down, the differences vanished. In that moment, there was only one purpose: to keep each other alive. It was his first real taste of combat, a horrifying initiation into a world he'd only imagined. And even as fear overwhelmed him, he did his duty with a calm he hadn't known he possessed. He saved a fellow soldier that day, dragging him to safety through gunfire, earning respect from his peers, though he didn't crave it. Bill had never been one to boast about his achievements. While others celebrated or sought recognition, he found solace in silence and a quiet sense of loyalty. He felt his actions were small offerings in the face of the sacrifices made by those who never returned. For him, honor wasn't about medals or ceremonies. It was about doing what needed to be done when others depended on him. Even after countless missions, he remained humble, not out of insecurity, but out of a deep understanding of the fragility of life and the cost of survival. This sense of quiet dignity defined him as a soldier and as a man. But the war took a toll far greater than the scars on his body. Bill remembered the friends he'd lost, each one a weight on his heart he carried into the present. The faces of his fallen brothers haunted his dreams, and the sound of their laughter still echoed in his mind. There were nights when he awoke drenched in sweat, his mind replaying scenes of loss and devastation. Every mission brought new sacrifices, and with each one, he lost a piece of himself. Those who survived carried not only their own pain, but also the memories of those who had fallen, like ghosts that never faded. The price of service was high. It wasn't just the physical wounds, though there were many of those. It was the emotional burden, the gradual erosion of innocence, the sense of hope that dimmed with each loss. His time in the war had aged him, giving him a quiet strength born from suffering and survival. Yet amid the pain, he'd also gained an empathy that ran deep, an understanding of human frailty and resilience. He'd witnessed acts of bravery that defied reason and acts of kindness that restored his faith in humanity. And this duality of suffering and compassion became the foundation of who he was. When he returned home, Bill faced a harsh new reality. The country he'd risked his life for no longer felt like the one he remembered. Instead of gratitude, he encountered indifference, even resentment. People looked at him with either pity or disdain, as if he was a relic of a past they preferred to forget. Strangers would dismiss his experiences, claiming he was part of a machine that didn't align with their vision of peace. And so, he became an outsider, carrying his memories and pain alone. In time, he learned to hide his past, knowing that most people wouldn't understand. He found solace only among other veterans, those who understood the silence of men who'd seen too much. This sense of alienation and disappointment became a wound that never healed, an unspoken sadness that shadowed him wherever he went. He had given so much, yet found himself in a world that didn't want to hear his story. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had fought for the freedom of his fellow citizens, yet felt as though he had lost his own. This disillusionment turned into acceptance, a quiet understanding that the world would never fully grasp what he and his brothers had endured. And so, he remained silent, a solitary figure carrying the weight of his past. As he stood facing the hostile crowd, his memories drifted back to the faces of his fallen comrades, those who had sacrificed their futures for the lives of others. He felt their presence with him, a reminder of the honor they'd upheld, a silent strength that helped him hold his ground. It was these memories that would shape his response, the quiet resolve to honor the lives of his friends by standing firm in his principles, even if the world no longer valued them. In his mind, the sneering faces before him faded, replaced by the proud, resilient faces of his brothers in arms. But as the memories faded, the present returned to him. The sneers, the mocking words, the assumptions of a generation who had never known the horrors of war. Bill looked around, seeing these young faces alight with a fiery certainty he recognized from his own youth. They couldn't understand, not yet, and in that moment, he knew that his silence was no longer an option. The price he'd paid, the lessons he'd learned, had to mean something. He would give them the reality check they sorely needed, not out of anger, but out of a hard-earned compassion they couldn't yet comprehend. The air thickened as the crowd's laughter grew, piercing through Bill's silence like shards of glass. The young activist threw insults like stones, each word laced with a bitterness Bill hadn't expected. "What's the matter, Grandpa?" one voice jeered, mocking the uniform cap that had come to represent years of service, hardship, and sacrifice. Still clinging to that old relic like it means something, the sneers echoed in the night air, and Bill felt the weight of each jab, sharp and relentless, cutting past his stoic exterior and into the memories that haunted him. But he said nothing, letting his silence speak for him, even as his heart began to tighten. The urge to defend himself simmered beneath the surface, his fingers itching to respond, to tell them they had no idea what sacrifice meant. A flicker of his old, disciplined resolve kicked in, and he forced himself to hold back. He was no stranger to restraint. It had been drilled into him from his first day in the service, the importance of maintaining control in the face of chaos. But the insults kept coming, each one testing his patience, chipping away at the restraint he'd mastered over the years. He could feel the line between discipline and anger blurring, yet he remained silent, bearing the brunt of their disdain. The crowd's perception of his silence only fueled their mockery. To them, he was a silent, defeated figure, too ashamed or too powerless to respond. They saw his stillness as weakness, his composure as surrender. One young man smirked, leaning forward, his voice dripping with contempt. "Look at him, can't even defend his own choices. Guess he knows he's part of the problem." The words stung, an echo of the alienation Bill had felt upon his return home from the war. It was the same message, dressed up in new voices and modern ideals, yet its sting was timeless. They didn't know the restraint he was exercising, the battles he was fighting inside himself to stay composed. Emily stood beside him, her face a mask of shock and hurt. She'd always known her father as a strong, silent man, a rock of wisdom and quiet pride. Seeing him endure this humiliation, standing tall but wounded, made her heart ache in a way she hadn't anticipated. She looked at him, searching for any sign of the defiant strength she'd grown up admiring. But all she saw was her father, his eyes a mix of calm and pain, as if he bore the weight of all his lost friends in silence. Her own emotions churned, a combination of anger, shame, and sorrow. She wanted to scream, to defend him, but his silence held her back, reminding her of the quiet dignity he'd always carried. Inside, Bill's emotions churned, a storm barely held in check. The tension clawed at him, his body remembering battles fought long ago, a reflexive urge to protect, to defend, rising within him. But he couldn't let himself give in to anger. That wasn't the lesson he'd learned on the battlefield. Anger had no place there, nor did it have a place now. He thought of the men he'd served with, the friends he'd lost, each one of them a reminder of the values he held close. They taught him that true strength wasn't about striking back. It was about holding steady when everything around you crumbled. But even now, the temptation to fight back whispered in his ear. Fragments of memories surfaced, flashes of faces and voices that had once been his world. He remembered the quiet bravery of his squad leader, who had shielded a fellow soldier in the middle of a firefight, sacrificing his life to save another. He remembered the soft-spoken medic who had risked everything to pull wounded soldiers from danger, his hands steady and calm despite the chaos around them. These were the heroes he had known, men whose bravery and humanity had left a mark on his soul. And with each memory, he felt a renewed resolve to stand his ground, to hold on to the principles that had been instilled in him through their sacrifice. Despite the insults, Bill found himself looking at the young faces around him, wondering what fueled their anger. He could see the passion in their eyes, the fire of idealism that came with youth. He understood, in his own way, the desire to change the world, the impatience to dismantle what they saw as broken. Part of him admired their courage, their willingness to stand up for what they believed in. Yet he also saw the danger in it, the blindness that came from thinking they had all the answers. They hadn't seen what he had seen, hadn't faced the fragility of life in the same way. And in that moment, he felt a pang of empathy for them, even as their words cut him deeply. The crowd's leader stepped forward, her face set in a sneer as she looked Bill up and down, her gaze dismissive, even cruel. "You're just a relic," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "A relic from a time that's long gone, and all you stand for, it's part of the problem." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final, as if she'd spoken an unarguable truth. Bill's eyes narrowed, his expression shifting as he felt the weight of her words, the culmination of every insult and dismissal he'd faced since returning home from the war. And in that moment, something shifted within him, a calm, steady resolve that went beyond anger. Bill's silence finally broke as he lifted his head and took a steadying breath. He'd held back for as long as he could, letting their words fall around him like rain, each one leaving its mark. But now, the time had come to speak. The crowd's voices softened, sensing a shift in the air, as Bill's calm gaze swept over them. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet intensity, a look that demanded their attention and respect. He held that gaze for a moment longer, allowing the silence to deepen. Before he finally spoke, his voice steady and unwavering. "I wasn't a combatant. I was a medic," he began, and the crowd stilled, their sneers fading as confusion flickered across their faces. The revelation of his role cut through the tension like a knife. For a moment, there was a pause, a silence that hung in the air as they processed what he'd just said. The crowd had assumed he was just another soldier, a faceless figure in a uniform they'd been taught to mistrust. But the word medic changed everything. It was a role synonymous with healing, with saving rather than taking lives. Some members of the crowd looked away, their assumptions already starting to crack, while others leaned forward, curiosity breaking through their hostility. Bill could see the questions forming in their minds, and he knew he had their attention in a way he hadn't before. Without raising his voice, Bill looked directly at the crowd's leader, his words directed at her, but meant for everyone. "I went to war not to harm, but to save," he said quietly. "I was there to pull men out of danger, to stop the bleeding, to keep them breathing long enough to make it home." He let his words sink in, the weight of them pressing down on the hostile energy that had filled the room just moments before. And it wasn't just our soldiers I helped. I treated civilians, locals who found themselves caught in the crossfire, no different from anyone else. You think I'm the enemy? I was risking my life to save people, anyone who needed it. No matter which side they were on, memories surfaced, sharp and vivid, of the lives he'd held in his hands. He thought of the young Vietnamese boy he'd bandaged after a stray bullet had torn through his leg, the look of fear and gratitude in the child's eyes. He remembered the elderly woman he'd carried out of a bombed-out village, her body frail and trembling as she clung to him, murmuring words he didn't understand but felt in his heart. These were moments that had stayed with him, haunting and humbling, reminders of the human cost of war. Each life he'd saved had been a battle against forces far beyond his control, yet he'd fought those battles with everything he had. As Bill spoke, he could see the change in their faces, the initial shock giving way to something deeper, something he hadn't expected to see: understanding. The young activists, who had only seen him as a symbol of everything they despised, began to see him as a man who'd risked everything to make a difference in the lives of others, even in a place where life was valued so little. Some shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing for the first time the weight of the judgments they'd cast so easily. The tension in the room softened, replaced by a strange quiet that felt almost reverent. One young man, standing near the edge of the crowd, met Bill's gaze with an expression that was no longer hostile. In his eyes, Bill saw a flicker of empathy, maybe even respect. The young man looked down, his shoulders slumping, as if the intensity of the moment had struck a personal chord. Bill couldn't be sure, but he sensed that this young man had his own struggles, his own reasons for questioning authority, perhaps a pain he'd buried as deeply as Bill's own scars. Whatever it was, the anger that had burned so brightly in the young man's eyes was now tempered by something softer, something that resonated with Bill's own experiences. Sacrifice, Bill continued, isn't about politics. It's not about sides or ideologies. It's about people, about saving lives, even when it costs you a part of yourself. Sacrifice is about giving without expecting anything in return. His voice softened, the raw honesty of his words hanging in the air. I lost friends, good men who went through hell and never made it back. They sacrificed everything, not for medals or parades, but for each other. And when I look back, I realize that's all any of us wanted, to protect the lives that were entrusted to us, no matter who they belonged to. The crowd listened in silence, their attention fully captured by Bill's words, the raw emotion in his voice revealing a depth of character they hadn't expected. Bill's eyes drifted back to the crowd's leader, her expression unreadable but no longer hostile. He could see her struggling to reconcile the man before her with the image she'd held in her mind. She had labeled him as the problem, as an enemy to her cause. But now she stood before a man who defied every assumption she'd made. The certainty in her eyes wavered, replaced by something less rigid, something more open. As Bill continued, he felt a strange calm settle over him, a release of years of silence and restraint. I don't expect you to understand everything I've been through, and I don't ask for your sympathy. But know this: every life I saved, every person I helped, was a victory over the hatred and violence that filled those years. His voice dropped, almost to a whisper, yet each word was clear. And that's what matters in the end, not the uniform I wore or the orders I followed, but the lives I saved. He looked around, the silence heavy, the weight of his words sinking in as he met the eyes of each person in the crowd. Then, finally, he turned back to the crowd's leader, her gaze meeting his with a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. She opened her mouth, as if to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she looked down, her expression troubled, as if questioning everything she'd thought she knew. The crowd around her was silent, their previous fervor replaced by a quiet, uneasy respect. Just as Bill was about to share one of the most harrowing experiences he'd endured, a night that still haunted him, one where he'd saved lives under impossible circumstances, the crowd watched in rapt silence. Each of them seemed on the edge of their seat, sensing the significance of his next words. Bill took a breath, feeling the weight of that memory press against his chest, a reminder of everything he'd sacrificed for the lives he'd saved. And for the first time in years, he felt ready to share it. The room was silent as Bill took a deep breath, his hand steady, but his voice carrying a tremor. He wasn't someone who showed his pain easily, but this memory was one he hadn't been able to escape. There was a day, he began, his eyes distant, his voice barely above a whisper, when I thought I'd meet my end out there. I was just a kid, really no different from any of you. But on that day, I nearly died saving someone I'd been told was the enemy. He paused, allowing his words to sink in, letting the crowd imagine the unimaginable. The scene replayed in his mind. The roar of explosions, the smell of smoke thick in the air, and the agonizing cries that filled the silence after the blasts. It was one of those battles that had left the ground littered with casualties, friends and foes alike. Amidst the chaos, he'd spotted a young soldier, barely older than a teenager, lying motionless in the dirt. Bill knew he was an enemy, but that didn't matter in the moment. He had stumbled toward the boy, his own body battered, and knelt beside him, noting the fear and confusion in the young man's eyes. Bill's duty, his very purpose, had kicked in. He couldn't abandon a soul in need, not even then. The crowd hung on his every word as he described those haunting details. The boy's face smeared with blood, his hand clutching at Bill's uniform with desperate strength, his eyes filled with a strange mix of gratitude and terror. Bill could still feel the weight of that boy's trembling body, the way he'd fought to keep him alive even as bullets whizzed overhead. He was just a kid, Bill said, his voice breaking slightly. He didn't understand why he was there, any more than I did. But in that moment, all I saw was someone who needed help, someone who deserved to live, no matter what side he was on. Around him, the young activists were visibly affected. Some lowered their eyes, unable to meet Bill's gaze, while others wiped at tears they hadn't expected to shed. The group that had sneered at him, that had mocked his uniform and ridiculed his past, now looked at him with something close to reverence. The anger that had filled their voices earlier seemed to have been washed away, replaced by a raw vulnerability as they absorbed the reality of Bill's experience. As Bill continued, he could sense the shifting tides within the crowd. The leader's hardened expression softened as she listened, her brows furrowing, as though wrestling with emotions she hadn't planned for. Bill didn't stop to judge them. He understood the naivety, the desire to change the world, and the idealism that came with it. But he also saw something breaking down, a dismantling of their preconceived notions as they grappled with the weight of what he was telling them. The faces before him weren't just hostile or skeptical anymore. Some looked guilty, as if realizing the depth of their misjudgments. Bill's voice grew firm, resonant with the truth he was sharing. War doesn't care about sides. Out there, we didn't see enemy or ally, just human beings struggling to survive. In that moment, I would have died for that boy as readily as I would for my own comrades. His words hung in the air, his conviction unmistakable, the simple honesty striking them more powerfully than any speech or lecture. I've watched friends die, felt their blood on my hands, and I've saved lives that others would say weren't worth saving. But I'd do it all again because, in the end, all that mattered was that we were human. The crowd's leader looked down, the fire in her eyes now dampened by the weight of Bill's words. A few of the others exchanged glances, their expressions uncertain, as if questioning the rigid beliefs they'd once held so tightly. Bill could see the change, the way his story had pierced through their defenses, challenging them in ways they hadn't anticipated. One young man in the crowd clenched his fists, his face pale, as if struggling with something unspoken, a realization, perhaps, or an apology he wasn't yet ready to voice. Emily watched her father, her heart swelling with a fierce pride and admiration she hadn't felt before. She had always known him as a strong, silent man, a rock in her life who never asked for recognition or praise. But hearing him now, seeing the raw honesty in his voice and the deep scars he still carried, she felt a surge of love and respect that left her blinking back tears. Her father wasn't just a veteran, a symbol, or a stereotype. He was a hero, a man who had given everything for the sake of others, even those he'd had no reason to save. The room was heavy with emotion, a mix of respect, empathy, and regret in the faces before him. Bill's voice wavered slightly as he continued, the vulnerability of the moment unmistakable. Every night, I still see those faces. Friends, civilians, even strangers whose names I never knew. They haunt me, not because of what I did, but because of what I couldn't do. I couldn't save them all, and that's a weight I carry every day. His voice grew softer, thick with the unspoken grief that lingered in his heart. You can call me what you want, judge me for wearing this uniform, but understand this. It represents sacrifice. Not just mine, but of every person who fought to protect the innocent. For the first time, Bill's voice shook, his stoic facade cracking as he laid bare the scars he carried. The weight of his words filled the silence, his pain and pride mingling into a palpable energy that seemed to touch each person in the room. A few of the young activists wiped at their eyes, visibly moved by the man who had endured so much yet asked for so little in return. Bill's vulnerability resonated with them, breaking down the barriers they had built up, leaving them raw and exposed to a truth they hadn't wanted to face. Finally, he looked at each of them, his gaze steady and unwavering. "This isn't about me, or even about you," he said, his tone gentle but resolute. "It's about understanding that we're all human, that we all have battles we're fighting, scars we're carrying. If you can see that, if you can open your hearts to that truth, then maybe we can bridge the divide that separates us." He paused, letting his words settle, each syllable weighted with the wisdom of his experiences. And then, with a gaze so intense it felt like a challenge, he looked at the leader of the crowd, as if daring her to see him, not as an enemy or a symbol, but as a man who had lived, suffered, and sacrificed. The silence stretched, the air thick with an unspoken tension. Each person in the room waiting for what would come next, the emotions churning within them too profound to put into words. Bill shifted his weight, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the young activists who, until now, had seen him as nothing more than a symbol of something they despised. But he didn't look at them with disdain. Instead, his expression held something closer to empathy, as if he understood their frustration and anger better than they might realize. "I get it," he began, his voice calm, yet filled with purpose. "I know what it's like to feel that the world isn't fair, to feel that no one's listening. I remember those years before I went to war, thinking the world needed to change, thinking someone needed to fix things." The crowd fell silent, a flicker of surprise crossing their faces. They hadn't expected him to relate to their cause at all. Bill leaned forward, his voice steady as he continued. "But I'm here to tell you that change doesn't come from shouting the loudest or throwing stones at the people who don't see things your way. Real change, meaningful, lasting change, comes from hard work, sacrifice, and a willingness to stand firm, even when it's uncomfortable." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You think standing here and calling me names is making a difference? Let me tell you, real change is a lot harder than that." A ripple of tension passed through the group, but Bill's expression was unyielding, his eyes sharp as he pressed on. He wasn't here to demean them or their beliefs, only to open their eyes to a reality they hadn't yet faced. "You talk about fighting for a better world, for fairness and justice," he said. "But you have to understand, life won't hand that to you on a silver platter. You'll have to fight for it, and sometimes you'll have to fight your own sense of entitlement, your own idea of what's fair. Life is a battlefield in ways you haven't even begun to understand." The young leader's face softened, her defiance wavering as she listened, her anger replaced by something resembling introspection. Bill's words weren't meant to tear them down. Instead, they served as a reality check, a reminder that their passion, while noble, wasn't enough on its own. He wasn't trying to diminish their cause, only their approach. And as she met his gaze, she realized he was giving them something valuable, a chance to see things from a perspective that went beyond their experience, beyond their ideals. Emily watched with a sense of pride, noticing the change in the crowd's demeanor. She could see the arrogance in their expressions slowly crumbling as Bill spoke, and for the first time that evening, she felt a sliver of hope. Hope that maybe her father's words, born from a lifetime of sacrifice and hardship, could bridge the gap between their generation and his. Hope that understanding might be possible, even in a world that often seemed divided beyond repair. Around the room, the reactions varied. Some of the activists looked down, visibly affected by what Bill was saying, as if suddenly uncertain of their own convictions. Others crossed their arms defensively, their expressions hardening, unwilling to let go of their anger. But even those who resisted couldn't deny the weight of his words, the truth that hung in the air between them like a tangible force. He had seen and endured things they could only imagine, and his calm yet unyielding demeanor spoke louder than any protest ever could. Taking a steadying breath, Bill looked at each of them in turn, his gaze unflinching. "The world isn't black and white," he said quietly. "In war and life, you learn that everyone has their reasons. Everyone has a story, a struggle, a purpose. It's not about enemies or allies, right or wrong. It's about trying to do what's right, even when it costs you something." He swallowed, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "And sometimes, you'll have to stand alone. And that's when you find out what you're really made of." His words lingered, sinking into the minds of the young crowd as they grappled with the revelation. One of the younger activists glanced at him with a newfound respect, his face etched with thoughtfulness rather than anger. Another young woman looked down, wiping at her eyes, seemingly moved in a way she hadn't expected. The group's leader, who had been so vocal and defiant before, was silent, her expression pensive as she took in every word. Bill glanced over at Emily, catching her eye, and in that moment, she saw the depth of his pain and resilience, his strength forged not just by war, but by years of grappling with the complexities of life. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, a profound respect swelling in her heart. Her father had never been one to seek attention or recognition, yet here he was, laying his soul bare for people who might never truly understand his sacrifice. The crowd was tense, filled with emotions they couldn't quite name. Some looked at Bill with a hint of shame, others with admiration, as if seeing him in a new light. He could sense their inner conflict, the struggle between holding onto their ideals and acknowledging the truth he had shown them. But he didn't judge them. He understood the journey they were on, the desire for justice that often clouded the complexities of real change. With a final glance around the room, Bill leaned forward, his voice low, but laced with a steely intensity. "You want to make a difference?" he said, his tone both a challenge and an invitation. "Then start by seeing people for who they are, not what you think they represent. Respect their stories, understand their struggles, and remember that sometimes change starts with listening rather than shouting." He paused, his gaze piercing, the weight of his experiences behind every word. "If you want to fight, fight with respect and understanding. That's where real power lies." He let his words hang in the air, the silence between them charged, as if he had given them something precious, something they hadn't even known they were searching for. The crowd was still, their earlier hostility now tempered by reflection, by the undeniable impact of his message. They had come to confront him, but instead, they found themselves confronted by the hard truth of his experiences, by a reality that had stripped away the simplicity of their beliefs. And as Bill held their gaze, he knew he had done all he could. The rest was up to them. The room was quiet as Bill prepared to share one last story, his words like a soft current, drawing them into a world they had never known. "I don't say all this to prove anything," he began, his voice steady yet carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "But I'll tell you something that shaped me, something I still carry." He looked down, as though sifting through the painful memories before choosing one he was willing to share. During the war, there was a young man, barely 19, his whole life ahead of him, but he didn't make it back. His voice caught, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "And for years, I've wondered why it was him and not me." A hush fell over the crowd as they absorbed his words. He wasn't sharing a story for pity. He was offering a glimpse into the raw humanity beneath his composed exterior. "That young man," Bill continued, his tone soft but resolute, "taught me something that no medal, no rank, and no ceremony ever could. Life is fragile, and respect, it isn't just given, it's earned every day in how you treat others, in how you carry yourself. He paused, the silence thick with the gravity of his words. He didn't ask for recognition or glory. All he wanted was to help the people around him. Bill's gaze swept over the young activists, and for the first time, they seemed to look back with something beyond anger or defiance. They saw him not as a relic or an adversary, but as a man who had known unimaginable pain and loss, who had come through it with quiet dignity. The depth of his wisdom, distilled through years of experience, resonated with them in a way they hadn't anticipated. Some felt tears prick at their eyes, while others stood in silence, grappling with the realization that his life was a living testament to humility and strength. At the back of the room, one of the activists, young, with a hardened expression softened by the vulnerability of the moment, took a shaky breath and, for the first time, spoke up. I'm sorry, they stammered, their voice thick with emotion. I came here because I felt like nobody understood me, like nobody cared. Their confession cut through the tension, bearing a pain that mirrored Bill's in its own way. I thought if I yelled loud enough, if I could just make people see, maybe things would be different. Their voice trailed off, choked with emotion. Bill's expression softened, compassion filling his gaze as he regarded the young person before him. He knew that kind of pain, that feeling of shouting into the void, hoping someone would hear. I understand, he said gently, his voice a balm to the raw emotion in the room. Life can feel like a battle, even when you're not on a battlefield. And I'm not here to tell you your anger is wrong. But anger alone won't change the world. His words reached them on a level that transcended age or ideology, turning confrontation into understanding. Emily watched, her heart swelling with pride for her father. This was the man she had always known, strong, compassionate, and deeply wise. She blinked back tears as she saw him bridge a divide that had felt insurmountable. He had taken their anger, their hurt, and turned it into something transformative. In that moment, she understood the full extent of his courage. It wasn't just the courage to fight in war. It was the courage to face his own pain, to show empathy even to those who had once disrespected him. The young activists looked around at each other, their perspectives shifting, their earlier certainty tempered by the quiet power of Bill's words. They realized that they had approached him with judgment, seeing only what he represented and not who he truly was. And in doing so, they had missed the opportunity to learn from someone who had lived through struggles they could barely imagine. A newfound respect filled the room, mingling with a quiet acknowledgement that progress required not only passion, but also humility and understanding. Bill took a deep breath, his voice firm but filled with kindness. I know you want to make a difference, he said, looking each of them in the eye. But the real question is, who do you want to be in this world? Do you want to fight just to be heard? Or do you want to fight to truly make a change? His words challenged them, asking them to look beyond their immediate frustrations, to consider the legacy they wanted to leave behind. It was a question that required courage, introspection, and a commitment that went deeper than anger. He rose slowly, his body showing the scars of time and battles fought, but his spirit unbroken. He stood there, a testament to resilience and strength, a reminder that the battles that truly mattered were often fought in the heart and mind. His presence filled the room, a quiet force that commanded respect. The activists watched him with newfound admiration, seeing him not as an opponent but as a guide, someone who had walked a path they were only beginning to understand. As he turned to leave, his hand resting lightly on Emily's shoulder, a voice called out from the crowd, hesitant yet filled with sincerity. Wait, the young leader said, her tone no longer mocking or defiant. I'm sorry for what I said. Can you forgive us? The words hung in the air, fragile and sincere, a bridge extended across the divide they had once created. The crowd drifted apart slowly, their once defiant faces softened by introspection. Bill's words echoed in their minds, a quiet reminder of the strength that comes not from shouting, but from understanding, from living by principles instead of just professing them. Each activist departed with a changed expression, carrying away pieces of a story that challenged them to reevaluate not only their cause but their approach to life itself. The slogans, chants, and anger that had once defined them felt hollow compared to the depth of Bill's lived experience. Emily stood beside her father, watching as the crowd dispersed. She looked up at him with newfound admiration, the weight of his wisdom settling in her heart. In all her life, she had never seen him like this, so powerful in his vulnerability, so steady in his beliefs. She realized that strength wasn't about loud declarations. It was about resilience, about holding firm to your values, even when the world seemed to misunderstand you. Inspired, she knew she wanted to share his story, to let others see the quiet heroism he embodied. As the activists left, each one walked away with a distinct shift in their outlook. No longer did they see themselves as mere challengers of the old order. Bill's words reminded them of the importance of humility, of approaching their ideals with both passion and empathy. They began to understand that the world was not split into simple binaries of right and wrong. True change, they realized, was a hard-won journey that required not only conviction, but also the courage to listen, to respect the wisdom of those who had come before them. Walking away from the gathering, Bill felt a rare sense of peace. He had held on to his values, shared his story, and perhaps even inspired a few to see beyond their anger. As he reflected on the conversation, he felt as though he had honored the friends he had lost in the war, those who had fought and sacrificed not for recognition, but because they believed in something greater than themselves. He hoped that these young people would remember his words, that they would carry forward the legacy of compassion, respect, and resilience that he held so dear. A newfound purpose stirred within Emily as she walked beside her father. The world needed to hear his story, the quiet power of a man who had seen the worst of humanity but still believed in its potential for good. She decided, then and there, to write his story, to capture his legacy, so that others might find inspiration in his journey. It was a promise to herself and to him, a way to ensure that his values would live on, touching lives long after he was gone. As she reflected on the night's events, Emily felt a shift within herself. She no longer saw her father merely as a figure from a past she couldn't understand. She saw him as a guide, a man who had been through unimaginable hardship, yet emerged with a spirit unbroken. A man who had quietly passed on values she would carry for the rest of her life. She resolved to live by those principles, to be a voice for compassion, humility, and respect in a world that often forgot their importance. As the last traces of the crowd disappeared into the night, Bill stood tall, his silhouette framed by the fading light of the evening. He was a living testament to resilience and humanity, a reminder that true strength lay not in overpowering others, but in holding firm to one's beliefs, in choosing compassion over confrontation. As he walked into the twilight, his figure seemed to embody the strength of a life well lived, a quiet symbol of what it meant to face life's battles with dignity and grace.